At the top of a golden tower where the desert meets the silence lives a prince who was once feared, and today he only observes. Alexander doesn't speak of his pains. He hides them in his eyes and in the wheels that keep him grounded. No doctor has been able to reach him. No voice has broken the wall of his solitude. Until she arrived. Luna, the woman from distant winds who didn't ask for permission to enter, but whose hands knew exactly where to touch. But what happened next, no one there could have imagined. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this message from? Your presence here turns each story into a shared home. The sun of Solterra did not rise gently. It burst forth fierce and unrelenting, painting the dunes in hues of molten gold and crimson. But from the highest tower of the palace, where the wind barely reached and the laughter of courtiers had long vanished, Alexander sat motionless, staring beyond the endless sands. He used to stand there, once, tall, strong, defiant. The youngest commander of Solterra's cavalry, his name alone was enough to send tremors through enemies. But that was before the explosion, before the betrayal, before his world was reduced to polished marble floors and a chair that creaked beneath his broken spine. Now the only movement he commanded was the subtle shift of light as it passed through the arched windows. Servants had long since learned to avoid his chamber unless summoned. His silences were sharp, and when he spoke, his voice was colder than the palace stones at midnight. He didn't want pity, didn't want prayers, and certainly didn't want another healer offering hope he no longer believed in. He was, by all appearances, a king in waiting, wrapped in silks, attended by loyal guards, and surrounded by opulence. Yet every morning he woke inside a cage he could not escape. His world was silence, routine, shadows, until Elias entered that morning, breathless and persistent, disrupting everything with 6 words that sliced through the air like a sword. "She's here, the healer from Evermere." Alexander didn't look away from the horizon. "Send her back." Elias stepped forward, cautious. "She's not like the others." "They never are," Alexander muttered. "Until they are." But Elias stood his ground. That alone was rare. "This one doesn't speak of miracles. She doesn't claim to heal the spine. Only the man who carries it." That earned him a glance. Brief, piercing, dangerous. "I don't need riddles, or someone to rearrange my pillows and call it therapy." "She refused an escort," Elias continued almost nervously. "Walked through the gates herself. She carries no instruments, just a bag of herbs and conviction." Alexander exhaled sharply through his nose, a mockery of a laugh. "Conviction won't make me walk." "No," Elias agreed, "but perhaps it will make you feel alive again." That silenced the room. For a moment, something flickered behind the prince's eyes. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. "Fine," he said. "She gets 1 month. Then she's gone." The doors to his chamber opened that afternoon. She didn't knock. Luna stepped in as if she belonged there, wearing a simple robe dyed in desert ochre, a satchel slung across her shoulder. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her eyes, those strange, unwavering eyes, scanned the room. Not him. He watched her in silence. No curtsy, no bowed head. She approached slowly, deliberately, and when their eyes met, she held his gaze without blinking. "You're Alexander," she said, not as a question but a fact. "And you're already dismissed," he replied dryly. She didn't flinch. "I don't cure people who don't want to be helped." "Good. Then leave." Instead, she walked past him, ignoring the sharpness in his tone, and placed her satchel on the table. The scent of herbs followed her, a warm, earthy blend of rosemary and something wild he couldn't place. "I'm not here to make you walk," she said without looking at him. "I'm here to remind you that you're more than legs and titles." That struck something inside him, something raw. He wheeled closer, his voice low. "You presume much." "No," she said calmly. "I observe." And for the first time in years, Alexander had no response. That night, he couldn't sleep. The room smelled faintly of her, of salt air and pine leaves, of earth after rain. He hated how his mind lingered on her voice. how her presence had disrupted the stillness he'd crafted so meticulously. She didn't ask about the accident, didn't offer pity, didn't even mention the chair. That more than anything unnerved him. The next morning she returned. He expected her to start with rituals, to touch him. Instead, she lit a small bowl of herbs by the window and sat opposite him, folding her legs like a monk. "Close your eyes," she instructed. He stared at her, incredulous. "I don't meditate." "I didn't ask you to. I asked you to close your eyes." Something in her tone, unshaken, gentle but firm, left him no room for argument. Against his better judgment, he obeyed. "Breathe," she said, "not like a soldier, like a man who forgot he's alive." And so, in silence, with the sun warming his face, the prince, who hadn't trusted anyone in years, let himself inhale something more than air. He inhaled memory, regret, anger, grief. But somewhere beneath all that was stillness. And when he opened his eyes, Luna was watching him, not with sympathy, but with recognition. That evening he wheeled to the window alone. No servant helped him. He didn't even realize it until halfway there. A small thing, but to him, it felt like thunder. As he stared out across the desert, the sands shifted in the distance, shimmering under the dying light. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like they were mocking him. He didn't know what Luna was doing, but something in him was moving. Something was waking up. And just as he closed his eyes again, he felt it, not in his legs, but in his chest. A flicker, a pulse, a beginning. She arrived at dusk, just as the desert sun began its slow descent behind the golden dunes of Solterra. The palace gates opened for her, not with ceremony, but with curiosity. The guards had never seen a woman quite like this. She didn't wear the robes of nobility, nor did she travel with an entourage. There was no royal crest, no chariot. Just a solitary figure wrapped in a robe the color of sun-warmed clay, her satchel slung over one shoulder, her eyes as steady as the wind she walked against. Her name was Luna, and the wind, it seemed to follow her. The palace steward, Elias, met her at the gates. He was a man of routines, of cautious words and careful gestures, but Luna's presence disarmed him before she even spoke. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, offering a hand. She looked at it briefly, then shook it with a grip firmer than he anticipated. "No one ever is," she replied. They walked through the stone corridors in silence. The air inside the palace was thick with the scent of incense and polished wood. Servants peeked from behind archways, whispering about the woman who claimed no title but whose name traveled farther than most kings. Luna took everything in quietly, the etched tiles beneath her feet, the velvet curtains hanging like sleeping spirits, the way even the walls seemed to hold their breath. She did not comment. She simply listened. Not with her ears, but with her presence. "He won't welcome you," Elias warned as they approached the west wing. "He hasn't welcomed anyone in 3 years. I'm not here for his welcome," she said calmly. He stopped walking. "You're aware of what happened to him, aren't you?" She met his gaze. "He was betrayed, he fell, he broke, and now he wears that pain like a second skin." Elias blinked, surprised. "That's not in any of the reports." "I don't need reports," she said. "I feel people." He resumed walking, this time with a strange reverence in his steps. They reached the outer chamber of Prince Alexander's quarters. Before Elias could knock, Luna raised a hand. "Let me go in alone." He hesitated. "He has thrown out trained physicians, threatened mystics. He once broke a cane over the head of a priest who dared mention healing." Luna's voice was quiet, but firm. "I won't mention healing." Then she stepped through the heavy doors. The chamber was vast, dimly lit by the last rays of sunlight filtering through arched windows. Alexander sat by one of them, his back to the door, the outline of his wheelchair casting a long shadow across the marble floor. He didn't turn. "Leave whatever potion you brought and go," he said, his voice laced with tired sarcasm. Luna didn't move. "I don't carry potions," she replied softly. His head tilted slightly. He hadn't expected a woman, certainly not one with a voice like hers, low, clear, without fear or flattery. "I don't do miracles," she continued. "I listen to the body. And sometimes it whispers things the soul refuses to hear." He turned then, slowly, to face her, and for the first time in years, he blinked. She wasn't beautiful in the way court ladies were. She wore no jewelry, no perfume. Her face was sun-kissed, her hair wind-tossed, but her eyes, those eyes, were like a storm held still. They unsettled him. "Who sent you?" he asked, studying her like a puzzle. "Your steward, your kingdom, maybe even your body," she answered. "But I chose to come." He wheeled closer, curious in spite of himself. "And what exactly do you think you'll fix?" "I don't fix," she said. "I work. With breath, with energy, with presence. But nothing moves unless you do." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "If I could move, we wouldn't be having this conversation." She stepped closer, her tone steady. "I'm not talking about your legs." Silence thickened between them. He narrowed his eyes. "You're very sure of yourself?" "No," she said, "but I'm sure of what I've seen. Men with broken spines, who led armies with nothing but their voice. Women with shattered hearts, who healed whole villages. And what do you see when you look at me? A man who stopped being a man the day he stopped being seen." That hit harder than he expected. He wheeled backward slightly, unsure why he felt exposed. She turned and began unpacking a few things from her satchel. Dried herbs, a small bowl, stones smooth from years of handling. "I'm not staying in the guest wing," she said casually. He raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me. I'll sleep outside your chamber, in the side room. I need to observe how you breathe at night, how you dream, how you avoid dreaming." His jaw tightened. "That's not how things are done here. I'm not here to do things your way, Alexander." The sound of his name on her lips felt strange, not formal, not reverent, just real. For the first time in a long while, someone had entered his space and didn't shrink beneath his shadow. She wasn't here to worship him, or fix him, or mourn what he used to be. She was here to see him. And that terrified him more than any war ever had. That night he did not sleep. He could hear her movements in the side room, the soft brushing of cloth, the grinding of something in a bowl. No whispers, no prayers, just quiet purpose. And outside, the wind howled against the walls of Solterra. But in his chest, it stirred softer. He wondered if it was possible, if something had already begun to shift. The morning after Luna's arrival, the palace awoke to something unfamiliar, movement in the West Wing. Alexander's attendants, usually dismissed within seconds, were ordered to prepare the treatment chamber. The heavy drapes were pulled back, letting light flood into rooms that hadn't seen the sun in months. Dust, long undisturbed, rose like ghosts in golden beams of morning light. But the man at the center of it all was far from welcoming. Alexander sat rigid in his chair, eyes narrowed as Luna arranged vials and cloths on a side table. She worked in silence, her movements methodical, her face unreadable. "Are you going to start with chants?" he asked, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Or perhaps burn some sacred leaf and call it divine intervention?" Luna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she dipped a piece of cloth into warm water infused with herbs. The room filled with the scent of eucalyptus and lavender, sharp, clean, unsettling. She finally spoke, not looking at him. "I don't chant, and I don't pretend to be divine, but you're welcome to keep hiding behind mockery if it makes you feel powerful." His jaw tightened. "Mockery is all I have left." "No," she said, wringing the cloth. "You have pain, and pain makes you cruel, but cruelty doesn't make you strong." That silenced him. Luna approached slowly, her hand holding the cloth steady. "May I?" He stared at her, trying to decide if the firmness in her voice was arrogance or courage. Either way, it disarmed him. He gave a slight nod. She knelt beside him, placing the warm cloth along the line of his spine. The heat spread gently through his back, and he flinched, not from pain, but from the intimacy of the gesture. "I don't need comfort," he snapped. "I'm not offering comfort," she replied calmly. "This is to soften the muscles, or what's left of them." Her fingers pressed along the edge of his ribs, firm but controlled. She wasn't afraid to touch him, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid of him. Alexander had long grown used to people tiptoeing around his body, as if it were made of glass. Luna, instead, treated it like a battlefield she intended to reclaim. "So," he said between clenched teeth, "how long until you claim I'm healing?" "I won't," she said. "Healing doesn't look like walking. It looks like choosing not to hate yourself when you wake up." That struck somewhere deeper than he expected. "You think you know me?" he hissed. "No," she answered, "but I can feel you've forgotten yourself." He turned his face away, lips tight, eyes suddenly too bright. "You don't understand what it's like. To go from everything to nothing." Luna paused, then gently shifted her touch to his shoulder. "You still breathe. That's not nothing." He looked at her then. Really looked. And for a second she saw something flicker in him. Rage, sorrow, maybe both. "You think this is breathing?" he asked bitterly. "This? Sitting here, watching the world from a window like a broken ornament?" "You're not broken," she said softly. "You're angry. You're afraid. But you're still here. And if you're here, it means something in you hasn't given up." He wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, he looked away again. "I agreed to 1 month. Don't mistake that for surrender." "I don't want your surrender, Alexander," she said, rising to her feet. "I want your truth." He exhaled slowly, watching her as she moved back to the table. The room was still filled with tension, like a storm suspended in mid-air. But under it, something else stirred. Curiosity, unease, the faintest edge of something he didn't dare name. Later that day, Alexander dismissed his guards early. The silence of the palace returned, but it no longer felt protective. It felt exposed. He wheeled himself to the mirror near the bed, something he hadn't done in months. His reflection stared back at him, sharp jaw, sunken cheeks, eyes that had lost too much sleep and seen too much loss. He traced the edge of his face with one hand. "She doesn't pity me," he murmured aloud. For the first time since the accident, someone had touched him like he was real. That evening, Luna returned for the second session. This time she brought a different blend, clove and frankincense. The scent grounded the room in something ancient. "You don't speak much when you work," he noted, trying to regain some control. "I listen better in silence," she said. "The body always speaks first." "And what is mine saying now?" he asked with a cynical smirk. She didn't smile. "It's tired of being treated like a prison." He laughed bitterly. "It is a prison." "No," she said. "The prison is in your mind." He turned away, unwilling to look at her, but her words lingered, like a splinter beneath the skin. That night, sleep evaded him again. The air felt too alive, every sound too loud, every breath too shallow. His mind kept returning to her voice, her touch, her refusal to flinch. No one had ever spoken to him that way, not since before the accident, not since he was a man who commanded armies and believed his name alone could shape the world. Now, he didn't know what he believed. But one thing was certain: this woman, this healer with winds in her eyes, was not afraid to see what he had become. And worse, she might be the first person who refused to let him stay that way. The first morning of treatment began before the sun crested the dunes. The palace was still asleep, save for a faint rustle of fabric and the low hum of heated water being poured into copper basins. Luna was already in Alexander's chamber. She worked quietly, her movements slow and precise, as if aware that noise could crack whatever fragile space had begun to form between them. A wooden bowl sat steaming beside her, filled with herbs steeped in lavender, camphor, and pine. The air smelled of old forests and rain-soaked earth, scents foreign to Solterra, like she'd brought pieces of distant lands with her. Alexander arrived in silence, wheeling himself in without a word. His face was unreadable, carved from habit and defiance. "You're early," Luna said, not looking up. "I couldn't sleep," he replied flatly. "Your herbs made my entire room smell like a forest." "It's working then," she said. He huffed, unsure if she was mocking him. "If you think you can massage me into a miracle, save yourself the trouble." "I don't want a miracle," she said. "Just honesty." That silenced him. Again. The first exercise was deceptively simple. She guided his hand to a wooden rod wrapped in linen. He gripped it clumsily. She placed her fingers over his, adjusting the angle, not with hesitation but with certainty. There was no gentleness in her touch, no fear of breaking him, just presence. That disturbed him more than he cared to admit. "You're not going to ask if it hurts," he muttered. "I can feel if it does," she replied, watching his shoulders, not his face. They moved in silence, her hands guiding, his body resisting. Muscles long unused trembled beneath his skin, not from pain, from memory. At one point the rod slipped from his grasp. It clattered to the floor loud in the stillness. He cursed under his breath. "This is ridiculous." She bent to pick it up. So is grief, when it's worn for too long. He looked at her sharply. She met his gaze without blinking. "Let yourself be bad at this, Alexander. Let yourself fail. That's how you'll learn what's still alive in you." He said nothing, but he took the rod again. Over the next days, a rhythm emerged. She came early, stayed late, worked in silence, spoke with purpose. Alexander remained resistant, sarcastic, and at times downright cruel, but he stopped dismissing her. Once, she brought a bowl of water laced with rosemary and lemon. He leaned in without being asked. Another day, she adjusted his posture while he sat upright in bed. He didn't flinch when her hand brushed his shoulder. Small things, but Luna noticed. His fingers, once stiff, were beginning to flex with less resistance. His arms, though still weak, were gaining control. His eyes, once dulled by resignation, now followed her movements with something more dangerous than anger: curiosity. One morning she caught him watching her as she prepared the herbal mix. "What?" she asked without turning. "You never pity me," he said. "Not once." She paused. "Should I?" He didn't answer. But something in his posture softened. His shoulders, always held like armor, eased slightly, just enough for her to see the man beneath the prince. Later that day she brought out the sand tray. It was a shallow wooden box filled with warm, fine grains. She placed it on the table beside him, then guided his hand into it. "What is this?" he asked, suspicious. "Memory," she replied. "Touch is the first language your body knew. Let it speak again." He closed his eyes as his fingers sank into the sand. It was warm, soft, familiar. For a moment, his expression changed. The crease between his brows faded. His lips parted slightly, not in pain, but in recognition. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Something was returning. That night, he didn't summon the attendants. He moved himself from the chair to the bed, slowly, with effort, but alone. When his hand slipped, he didn't curse. He just exhaled and tried again. In the silence, he could still smell the sage she had burned that morning. He lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his body not as punishment, but as reality. His body was still his, not ruined, not lost, just different. The next morning, she brought a mirror. He scowled. "What's this for?" "To see yourself," she said simply. "I know what I look like." "No, you know what you remember looking like. Let the man in front of you be seen." He hesitated, but she placed it on the table anyway and walked away. When he finally looked, he didn't recognize himself at first. The sharp lines of his face were still there, but his eyes, they were clearer, less hollow. He looked awake. And then something strange happened. He reached for the mirror again, not out of vanity, but out of wonder. During that afternoon's therapy, she guided him through breathing techniques. Seated across from him, their knees almost touched. The desert heat hung heavy in the air, but neither moved to open a window. "Breathe in," she instructed. "Let it fill your lungs. Now hold. Feel it. Not just in your chest, in your stomach, your back, your ribs." He obeyed, slowly, deliberately. She watched his diaphragm rise. "Now let go, like you're letting go of something you've held for too long." He exhaled, and for a moment his entire frame relaxed. Not just his body, his expression, his breath, his presence. Luna felt it. Something unspoken had shifted. She didn't say a word. But when he opened his eyes, he looked at her, truly looked at her. And in the silence between them, something passed, not loud, not clear, but alive. There was a moment, brief and unspoken, when everything changed, and neither of them dared to name it. It wasn't a kiss, it wasn't a confession, it was something smaller, and yet far more dangerous. It happened on a quiet morning, when Luna reached for Alexander's hand to adjust his grip on a resistance band. Her fingers brushed his, not with hesitation but with the same confidence she carried in everything she did. But this time, something lingered. A pause. A spark. He didn't pull away. She noticed. He knew she did. And still, neither moved. The silence that followed was not the same silence that used to live between them, tense, heavy, built from walls and pain. This one was softer, charged, like the air before a desert storm. That day, the exercises were different. Alexander obeyed her instructions with more focus than before. His arms responded faster, his breathing was deeper, but it wasn't the progress that made Luna glance at him twice. It was the way he watched her now. Not with suspicion, not even with curiosity, but with attention. Real, quiet, undivided attention. Like her presence wasn't just necessary, it was wanted. At lunch, he surprised her. She was gathering her things when he said, "You haven't eaten." She looked at him, startled. "There's food in the next room," he added. "It's not much, but it's something." She hesitated, studying him. "I'm not a guest," she said carefully. "No," he replied, softer than she'd ever heard him speak. "You're not. But I wouldn't be doing this if not for you, so stay, if you want." She did. They ate in silence until he spoke again. "You never ask about who I was before." She swallowed. "You tell me who you are by how you carry what's broken." He studied her. "How you speak like someone who's lived through war." She didn't answer, but something passed between them again, like a thread stretched taut between two cliffs. No one pulled, no one let go. Over the next few days, the spark grew, not in declarations or stolen glances, but in gestures. He no longer flinched when she touched him. She no longer avoided his gaze when their hands met. She caught herself standing too close. He caught himself staring too long. One evening she entered the room to find him not in bed, but sitting upright by the open window. "You left the drapes open," he said. "I thought I'd try watching the sunset, the way you do." She said nothing, just smiled, softly, like the sky behind him. And he smiled back. But it wasn't just warmth that built between them. It was tension. Undeniable. Quiet. Dangerous. During one therapy session, she placed her palm flat against his chest to guide his breathing. His heart, once calm, skipped. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. She removed her hand slowly, almost reluctantly. "Your heartbeat is strong," she said, turning away. "You make it that way," he whispered. She didn't respond. And yet, everything in her body did. That night she stayed awake longer than usual. In the small side room she used as her quarters, she lit no candles. She didn't read, didn't write. She just sat there, knees pulled to her chest, wondering how long it would take for this fire to consume them both. Because it was there. It had always been there, hiding beneath each touch, each silence, each refusal to name what was clearly unfolding between them. But they were still healer and patient, still prince and outsider, still broken in different ways. And love, if that's what this was becoming, was the most dangerous thing either of them could allow. The next morning, Alexander asked something unexpected. "Why don't you ever smile when you work?" Luna raised an eyebrow. "Would it help the therapy?" "No," he said, "but I think I'd like to see it." She paused, unsure if he was joking. Then, slowly, she smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't rehearsed, it was honest. And he looked like he'd just seen sunlight for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, they shared tea in his chamber. She had brought a blend from Evermere, wild honey, thyme and ginger. He found the flavor strange but comforting. They didn't speak much, but their silences no longer felt empty. They felt like pages being written. That evening, something shifted. Luna finished the final session of the day and went to leave. Her hand was on the door when his voice stopped her. "Luna." She turned. He looked at her, really looked. "I know I'm not easy." You're not, she agreed gently. But this, he gestured toward his chest. This thing between us, it's real, isn't it? Her breath caught. She didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because admitting it aloud would make it too real. He nodded, as if her silence confirmed everything. Good, he said, because I feel it, every time you walk in, and I don't know what to do with it. She stepped closer, slowly. I feel it too, she whispered. And just as she turned to leave again, their hands brushed. For a second, neither moved, and then he held hers, just for a moment, not as a prince, not as a patient, but as a man. And in that stillness, under the quiet breath of the desert wind, something deeper than words began to burn. The bath was meant to be practical, therapeutic, nothing more. Luna had prepared it the same way she had every week, methodically, with herbs steeped in heat and steam, sage for circulation, chamomile for calming, eucalyptus to draw out lingering tension. She had done this before. But today was different. The room was quiet, save for the occasional drip of water into the large stone tub nestled near the arched window. The fading sun cast an amber glow across the walls, wrapping the space in a warmth that felt almost sacred. Alexander wheeled himself in slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't joke this time, didn't taunt her with sarcasm. He simply watched her, silent, focused, as she adjusted the towels and poured the last of the oil into the water. "Shall we begin?" she asked, her voice soft, steady. He nodded. He had never let anyone assist him with bathing since the accident. It was the last sliver of dignity he guarded with quiet ferocity. But tonight, for reasons he didn't yet understand, he let the armor drop. He allowed her to see him, truly see him. Not as the prince, not as the patient, but as a man, wounded, bare. Still trying to believe he deserved to be touched, Luna approached, her hands gentle but sure. She helped him from the chair with practiced care, guiding him into the water with controlled breath and reverent silence. He gripped the edge of the tub, wincing slightly as his body adjusted to the heat. "You're tense," she murmured. He gave a dry laugh. "Hard not to be when I'm exposed." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "No one here sees you as weak, Alexander," she said, her fingers trailing lightly along his arm. "Least of all me." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. She began the treatment slowly, pouring warm water over his shoulders, watching the steam curl around his neck. Her hands followed, applying gentle pressure along the ridge of his back, over the hardened knots of muscle. He leaned forward slightly, allowing her in, his breath slowing as her touch moved across him. It should have felt clinical, but it didn't. There was something in the way her hands lingered, the way her fingertips paused, not for technique, but for feeling, as if she wasn't treating him. She was learning him. He shivered, though the water was hot. "You're cold?" she asked. "No," he replied quietly. "Not cold. Just alive." As she worked, their silences filled with new weight. Not discomfort, not shame, longing. Luna reached for a cloth, dipping it into the water and bringing it to his neck. She gently cleaned the skin beneath his ear, her wrist brushing the line of his jaw. His breath hitched, so did hers. Their eyes met. For a moment, they both froze. The cloth slipped from her fingers into the bath, forgotten. Neither noticed. Her hand remained on his jaw, his moved to her wrist, and the space between them, once filled with tension, collapsed. She leaned in first. Or maybe it was him. Neither would ever be sure. All they knew was that their mouths met in the middle, gently, hesitantly, like a secret begging not to be heard. But once it began, it deepened. Slow, intense, barely breathing. His hand slipped behind her neck. Hers cupped the side of his face. They kissed like they were afraid to break each other, like two people who hadn't felt desire in so long. They forgot what it meant to be wanted. He felt her breath against his lips. She felt his heartbeat against her chest. It was real. It was irreversible. When they finally pulled apart, the world felt different. Luna's eyes searched his, uncertain. I didn't mean to." "You did," he said softly. And so did I. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. This changes things. He nodded. Everything. A long pause stretched between them. Neither knew what came next, but neither wanted to undo what had just happened. She helped him from the water in silence, wrapping a towel around his shoulders, her hands trembling now, where moments before they had been so certain. Alexander didn't speak either, but his gaze never left her, as she wheeled him back to the bed and adjusted the pillow behind his back. She paused before stepping away. "I'll come early tomorrow," she said, her voice quieter than usual. He reached for her wrist. Just a light touch, not to pull her back, but to keep her close a second longer. "Luna." She turned. His eyes held hers. "I don't regret it." Her throat tightened. "Neither do I." And with that, she left. That night, Alexander lay awake in the silence of his chamber, listening to the faint sounds of the wind outside. But it was no longer the wind that haunted him. It was her breath, her hands, her kiss. It played over and over in his mind like a fire he couldn't put out. And in the room beside his, Luna sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at her palms. They still burned where they had touched his skin, still remembered the shape of his jaw, the weight of his mouth. She wasn't supposed to feel this, not here, not with him. But something had been set in motion, and whatever came next, neither of them would be the same again. The morning after the kiss, the air inside Alexander's chamber felt colder. Not physically. Solterra's desert heat still pressed against the palace walls, but in the space between him and Luna, something had changed. And not for the better. She entered as usual, a tray in her hands, the scent of mint and sage drifting around her. Her face was calm, composed. Too composed. Alexander was already seated by the window, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the dunes beyond. He didn't turn when she walked in. "Good morning," she offered. A long pause, then a flat. "Is it?" Luna stopped in the center of the room, unsure whether to take that as sarcasm or warning. She set the tray down without a word, watching him from the corner of her eye. "You're up early," she tried again. "I didn't sleep," he replied. Still, he didn't look at her. The session began stiffly. Her hands moved mechanically. His posture was tense, resisting her touch more than usual. When she adjusted the pressure on his shoulder, he flinched, not from pain, but from something deeper. She pulled back. "Too much?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved his arm away and muttered, "We don't need to talk today." Her chest tightened. So it had begun. The retreat. She nodded once, stepping back. "As you wish, Your Highness." The title landed like a knife. He noticed. He was meant to. That afternoon she didn't return. He waited. Though he wouldn't admit it to himself, he listened for her footsteps beyond the door. But they never came. And in her absence, the silence returned. Not the one they had once shared, but the older one. The cruel one. The silence of shame, of self-protection. The kind that tastes like regret. In the solitude of his thoughts, Alexander replayed the night before in cruel loops. The kiss, the touch, the way she had looked at him, not as someone broken, but as someone real. And what had he done in response? Pushed her away, because it terrified him, because wanting her meant admitting how much he felt, and feeling meant risking pain again. Luna spent the evening in the gardens. She hadn't planned to stay away, but something in his voice that morning had slammed a door inside her. She had touched that man's soul. She had kissed him in his most vulnerable state, and instead of stepping closer, he had built another wall. She tried to tell herself she understood, that his coldness wasn't rejection, it was fear. But even knowing that didn't make it hurt less. So she let the wind cool her cheeks, and she didn't cry. But she wanted to. The next day, the rhythm was broken. He was waiting when she entered, but everything about him was different. The eyes that once searched hers now avoided them. The voice that had once softened around her was back to being sharp and clipped. "We're late," he said. "Let's begin." Luna hesitated, then nodded. As she worked, she noticed the distance in every movement. He didn't flinch when she touched him, but neither did he respond. His breath was shallow, his body stiff. She leaned closer to adjust the angle of his wrist. He pulled away. "I can do it," he said. She straightened. "Alexander." "I think it's better if we focus on the therapy," he interrupted. Her voice was barely a whisper. "And pretend the rest didn't happen?" His jaw clenched. "I'm not pretending. I'm choosing not to complicate this." Luna took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you regret it?" He didn't answer, and that silence was the answer. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the open window of her quarters, staring into the black stretch of desert, wondering if she had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. But then she remembered his touch, his mouth, the way he had held her like he needed her more than breath. No, it wasn't a mistake, it was real. He was just afraid, and still, she couldn't be the one to fix that. He had to choose it. On the third day, he spoke first. "I pushed you away," he said quietly, as she prepared the herbal compress. Luna paused, then turned to face him. "I noticed." He nodded, eyes on the floor. "I didn't know how to let myself need someone." A silence fell. Then she said gently, "You don't have to need me, Alexander, but you have to stop lying to yourself." He looked at her then, truly looked. "I'm not used to being seen," he admitted. "Well," she said softly, "you're seen now." And she walked to him, not to fix, not to forgive, but to stand by him while he decided whether or not to remove the armor himself. They worked in silence again, but this time the silence wasn't rejection, it was rebuilding. Something had cracked, something had withstood the heat of fear and still remained. Not broken, just reshaped. That night, Alexander wrote a note. He left it outside her door. 2 words. "Stay, please." The days that followed were quiet. Not the wounded silence of retreat, but the kind that settles after a storm, when the wind still lingers and the air feels charged. Alexander and Luna didn't speak of the kiss or the withdrawal that followed, but something between them had realigned, tentative, fragile, yet no longer avoidable. He let her touch him again. She let him hold her gaze, but neither of them knew that something darker was stirring beneath the palace walls. It began with a whisper. Luna had taken her tea that morning in the garden behind the east wing, a quiet corner frequented mostly by the servants. She liked it there. It grounded her, reminded her that life in the palace, though gilded, still pulsed with breath and labor. She had just sat down when 2 maids passed near the fountain, their voices low but urgent. "Again last night. He's moving things from the vault. They say it's for the Northern Alliance." "Northern Alliance? There is no treaty." "Not since the prince." Luna straightened. Their voices faded as they disappeared down the path, unaware that someone had listened. Someone who remembered every word. That afternoon, while preparing a new batch of oils for Alexander's therapy, Luna paused at his ledger, a thick journal bound in dark leather, always left open on the side table near his chair. She'd never touched it before, never needed to. But today, something pulled her. She glanced toward the door. He was still in council. She opened the last page. What she saw made her stomach tighten. 2 sets of notations side by side, one in Alexander's strong, deliberate handwriting, the other slanted, messier, marked with symbols used only by the finance magistrate. But the numbers didn't match, not even close. That evening she said nothing during the session, but Alexander noticed her silence. "You're distracted," he said, as she wrapped a heated cloth around his upper arm. "I overheard something," she replied. He stiffened slightly. "About me?" "No, about your vault, your trade agreements. Something isn't right." He went still. "Explain." So she did. The voices near the garden, the mismatched notations, the strange frequency of deliveries in the southern wing, always after dark, always under orders bearing his uncle's seal. Alexander listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes darkening. "That ledger stays locked," he muttered. "Not yesterday," she said gently. He looked at her, This time not as patient to healer, not as man to woman, but as prince to someone he trusted. "Do you realize what you're saying?" he asked. She nodded. "That someone close to you is bleeding your kingdom, slowly, quietly, and no one is questioning it, because you're still being treated like a shadow of the man you were." That hit him like an arrow. He turned away, staring into the fire. "I should have seen it," he said bitterly. "I've been too busy, surviving." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You've been fighting every day, but now it's time to stand." They met again that night, in secret. Alexander summoned Elias to the study. Luna was there too, standing behind him in silent support. "I need access to every vault transfer from the past 6 months," Alexander ordered. Elias blinked. "But, Your Highness, your uncle—" "Will be consulted once I've reviewed the numbers," Alexander interrupted coldly. "Until then, this stays between us." The old steward hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, my prince." 2 days passed. Luna returned from the baths one afternoon to find Alexander seated at his war table, the old wooden surface now covered in open scrolls, reports, and coded messages. He looked up when she entered. "You were right," he said. She froze. "You found it?" He nodded grimly. "My uncle has been funneling funds into phantom supply lines. Traders that don't exist. Armies that were never recruited. The southern mines are nearly dry." Luna swallowed hard. "Why?" "To weaken the kingdom, slowly, quietly, and eventually take it." Her heart pounded. "Does he know you found out?" "Not yet, but he will." He looked at her then, eyes filled with something dangerous, but focused. "I need you with me, Luna." She stepped forward. "I never left." That night, Alexander didn't sleep. He stared out at the desert, the moon high and silver, the dunes like frozen waves. For the first time in years he felt power return, not through his legs but through his mind, his voice, his fire. And she had lit it, not by fixing him, but by seeing him, clearly enough to know where the rot was hiding. In the early morning hours he summoned the Royal Guard captain. When the man entered the chamber, Luna stood beside Alexander's chair, tall, steady, silent. Alexander's voice was calm. "There's a list of names I need you to detain discreetly by nightfall. Begin with the Royal Treasurer, end with Lord Richard." The captain's brow rose, but he didn't question it. He looked at Luna briefly, then bowed. "As you command, my king." And just like that, Alexander was no longer just surviving. He was reclaiming his throne. But neither of them could guess that Richard already knew. And he wasn't planning to go down without a final move of his own. The arrests began at dusk. Guards moved through the palace like quiet shadows, collecting scrolls, seizing keys, escorting officials whose names had long been trusted. There were no shouts, no resistance, just stunned silence, and a chill that spread through the royal halls like smoke after a fire. By midnight, Lord Richard's name was the last on the list, but his chambers were empty. He had vanished. Alexander sat in the royal council chamber, the first time he had occupied it since the accident. The weight of the throne room was different now. It didn't suffocate, it challenged, and this time he didn't face it alone. Luna stood beside him, silent but steady, her presence like a tether to the ground beneath his wheels. Elias handed over the final report. 37 forged signatures, 2 million in vanished coin, and at least 4 false alliances that never reached our borders. Alexander let out a slow breath. "How long?" Elias lowered his gaze. "Since the first winter after your fall, when you stopped attending council meetings." Luna's hand brushed Alexander's shoulder, not to comfort, but to remind him, "You're not alone anymore." Later, in the privacy of his study, Alexander broke the silence. "You saved my kingdom." Luna turned from the window. "No. You reclaimed it." He looked up at her, his voice lower now. "You saw what no one else dared to look at. You told me the truth, even when I wasn't ready to hear it." She stepped closer. "I didn't come here to be safe, Alexander. I came to serve something greater than fear." He watched her carefully. "You've done more than that." He reached for something beside him, a small silver crest, engraved with the royal seal of Solterra. "I want you by my side, not just in the shadows, not just as a healer." She hesitated. What are you asking? I want you on the council, as my advisor, as my equal. Her breath caught. They won't accept it. They will, he said, with a steel in his voice that hadn't been there before. Because I will. She studied him for a long moment. You're changing. No, he said. I'm remembering who I was, and becoming who I was meant to be. She smiled. Then yes. And with that, a new alliance was born, not signed in blood or coin, but in fire, loyalty, and something far more rare. Truth. That night, he didn't summon his guards. He wheeled himself to Luna's quarters alone. When she opened the door, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, tired, proud, changed. She stepped aside, letting him in. They sat in silence on the floor, their backs against the wall, sharing a flask of desert wine. The night was quiet, the palace still. You could have left, he said, when I pushed you away. I thought about it, she admitted. But then I remembered how you looked at me when you weren't afraid. He glanced at her, and I wanted to see that again. His throat tightened. You do something to me, he whispered. She turned to him. What kind of something? You make me softer and stronger at the same time. She smiled faintly. Then maybe it's not me you're feeling. Maybe it's you, waking up. As the fire crackled low in the corner, he reached for her hand. She let him. No words, just fingers laced in silence. It was the simplest of gestures. And yet, in that moment, it felt like a vow. The next morning, Luna entered the war chamber beside Alexander as his equal. The council members stared. Some whispered. One elder even frowned. Alexander didn't wait for permission. This is Luna of Evermere, he announced, my personal advisor, and the reason this kingdom still stands. The room was silent. No one argued, because none dared challenge the fire in his voice, or the certainty in his eyes. That afternoon, they sat side by side reviewing recovery plans. She read strategy maps. He dictated letters of realignment. For the first time, their energy was united not in therapy, but in rebuilding something far larger than either of them. Solterra was no longer a prison. It was a kingdom being reborn, and they were shaping it together. But as the sun dipped low, a messenger arrived at the gates, breathless, pale. He handed Alexander a sealed parchment. The prince read it. His expression shifted. Richard, he murmured. Luna leaned in. Where? He fled south, Alexander said. He's rallying old allies, border rebels, those who still see me as broken. A beat of silence passed between them. What will you do? She asked. He looked at her, eyes fierce, steady. I'll show them that the king they feared still lives. The desert wind that reached the palace that night carried more than sand. It carried news of war. Richard had not fled in silence. He was stirring old resentments, gathering deserters, corrupt merchants, and exiled warlords from the southern border. And he had numbers, more than anyone expected. Solterra was under threat again. But this time its prince was awake. The war chamber came alive at dawn. Maps were unrolled across long wooden tables, lit by the golden flare of morning sun. The council murmured in anxious tones, the air thick with urgency. Yet when Alexander entered, wheeling himself past the arched doors without escort, the room fell into reverent silence. No one had seen him here in over 3 years. But the man who entered wasn't a ghost. He was a storm. Luna stood beside him as he took his place at the head of the table. His fingers rolled open a scroll, his voice calm, clear. Richard rides with approximately 200 men, armed, mobile. They plan to take the southern mines first, then push north. Elias leaned in. The palace guard can't hold them alone. They won't have to, Alexander replied. We don't need more blades. We need better sight. He looked around the table. Solterra doesn't need a warrior king today. It needs a mind that sees 10 steps ahead. He ordered communications reopened with the mountain tribes, long alienated by Richard's policies. He had Luna draft a coded message using Evermere's ancient runes, symbols few remembered but all respected. He redirected palace funds left untouched since his accident to arm the outer villages. He sent emissaries not to rally fear, but loyalty, because fear fades, loyalty endures. And he didn't do it from a horse, he did it from a chair, but no one questioned his authority, because the way he spoke commanded, and the way he looked at them reminded every soul in that room that this was still the prince who once stood between death and his kingdom. Now he led again, seated, yes, but unshaken. In the evenings, he and Luna reviewed movements in the old observatory. Holographic maps projected rebel paths onto glass panels. Luna stood by the compass table, reading enemy trajectories. Alexander sat beside her, issuing counter-orders, marking supply chains, adjusting flank positions with the precision of someone who'd never forgotten what it meant to protect his people. "This is who you were," Luna whispered one night, eyes gleaming. He turned to her. "No, this is who I still am." And in that moment, she saw it. His strength wasn't in the body he lost. It was in the fire he refused to let die. The first confrontation came at the outpost of Mirren Vale. Alexander, against every recommendation, insisted on being there, not as a figurehead, but as leader. He was wheeled into the command tent by Luna herself, as stunned soldiers stood at attention. He didn't waste time with formalities. "Richard expects a frightened boy hidden behind palace walls," he said. "Instead, he'll find a man who sees farther than his rage." He turned to the captain of the archers. "When he charges through the ravine, you wait for my signal." "But, Your Highness, my signal." No one argued, because the prince's voice no longer trembled. The battle lasted 27 minutes. Alexander watched from the cliff's edge in a reinforced chariot, custom-built by palace engineers on his orders. Luna stood beside him, her hand steady on his shoulder, ready for the worst. But he didn't blink. He waited, watched. And when the dust clouds rose from the rebels' charge, he waited longer still, until they were in the ravine, trapped by their own speed. Then he raised his hand, a single gesture. The sky filled with arrows. Victory wasn't in the blood spilled, it was in the silence that followed, and in the way his men looked at him afterward, not as a wounded king, but as a leader reborn. Back at the palace, the people lined the roads. They'd heard the story already, not of the battle, but of the prince who returned, the prince who couldn't walk, but who never stopped rising. Children placed flowers along the stones. Elders bowed as he passed. Luna, riding beside him, watched every face light with hope. Hope they hadn't felt in years. That night, Alexander stood, arms resting on the rails of the balcony overlooking the capital. He couldn't feel his legs, but he felt everything else: the breeze, the scent of dust and jasmine, the warmth of victory without arrogance. Luna joined him. "They'll remember this day," she said softly. He nodded. "Not because I fought." "No," she smiled. "Because you led." He turned to her. "I couldn't have done it without you." She tilted her head. "Would you have let yourself try?" Another pause. Then, with a quiet strength in his voice, "Maybe not. But you didn't wait for me to be ready. You showed me what was still there." They stood in silence, side by side. But the war wasn't over yet, and Richard wasn't finished. The palace bell rang at dusk, 3 slow chimes, low, deliberate, final. It was the sound of justice. Richard had been captured at the edge of the southern cliffs, trying to flee across the desert under a false name, with forged seals and a chest of stolen gold strapped to a camel that refused to obey him. His army had already dissolved. His allies had vanished like sand in the wind. Now, he stood shackled in the great hall of Solterra, no longer a regent, but a traitor. Alexander entered without ceremony. No crown, no robe. Just the quiet power of a man who no longer had anything to prove. He wheeled himself through the stone aisle as the court fell silent. His gaze found Richard's and held it. "You once called me weak," Alexander said. "Said the kingdom would die in the hands of a man who couldn't stand." He paused. "Look around. Solterra stands. And you." "Don't," Richard sneered. "You let a woman run your kingdom. A healer, a foreigner." Alexander's jaw tightened. "No," he said, "I let her save it." He turned to the guards. "Strip him of title and lands. Let him live, so he sees the kingdom rise without him." The judgment echoed like a closing gate, and when Luna stepped into the hall beside Alexander, the people didn't whisper. They bowed. That evening, the sky over Solterra was on fire with stars. The city below pulsed with celebration. Music drifted up from the lower courtyards. Lanterns danced like golden spirits above the rooftops, but Alexander remained in the quiet of his chambers, gazing out across the dunes. Until Luna entered. He didn't turn. "You were right," he said softly. She stepped closer. "About what?" "About everything." A long silence. Then he faced her. "I've worn a crown of stone since the day I fell. Let pain rule me. Let fear decide who I could be. But when you touched me, Luna, when you looked at me without flinching, something woke up." Her eyes softened. "You woke yourself." He shook his head. "No. I breathed because you reminded me how." He reached for her hand. She took it. This time, no hesitation. "Do you regret it?" she whispered. He stood, slowly, carefully, his hands gripping the rails of the balcony. His legs did not carry him far, but they carried him enough. He faced her. "I regret every day I kept you at a distance." Her breath caught. He stepped closer. "I tried to protect myself from you when all I ever needed was you." His hand touched her cheek, warm, real. "I'm not asking you to heal me anymore," he said. "I'm asking you to choose me, as I am. Not as a prince, not as a man trying to be whole, but just me." Her eyes shimmered. "I already did." He leaned forward. Their lips met again, this time with no confusion, no shame. Just the fullness of everything they had survived to feel. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was earned. And when they pulled apart, her forehead rested against his, their breath shared in the space between heartbeats. That night, he didn't sleep alone. Not for lust, not for comfort, but for connection. For the first time, he let himself be seen, fully. The scars, the stillness in his lower limbs, the fragility he once feared. And she never looked away. Her touch was reverent, not careful. Her gaze said, "You are still whole." And when they lay side by side, skin to skin, soul to soul, the silence between them was sacred. In the early hours before the city woke, he whispered into her hair, "You are not mine, because I need you." She stirred, eyes half open. "You are mine because you saw me before I remembered how." She smiled. "Then don't forget again." "I won't," he promised, and meant it. Later that day, he stood before the people of Solterra, not from the throne, but from the courtyard. His voice rang clear. "Let this day be remembered, not as the end of a war, but the beginning of a reign built on trust." He turned toward Luna, standing just behind the arch. "And let all who doubted remember, strength is not measured by what you command, but by what you choose to love." And in front of thousands he offered his hand. She took it. No hesitation, no doubt. And the people roared. But in the shadow of a distant dune, far from the cheers and lanterns, a lone rider watched the celebration from afar. Not all enemies fall in chains. Some wait. The kingdom of Solterra no longer whispered. It sang. 5 years had passed since the fall of Richard, and the desert city once haunted by shadows now bloomed like a miracle after rain. Marketplaces pulsed with color and laughter. Musicians filled the courtyards. The scent of honeyed bread and jasmine drifted through the sun-warmed air. And at the heart of it all stood the palace, not as a fortress, but as a home. Inside, the halls were no longer cold. The silence that once gripped them had been replaced by something alive. The pitter-patter of small feet, laughter, and tiny voices calling, "Papa!" Alexander turned his chair from the window, just as a blur of curls and light slammed into his lap. His daughter climbed up without waiting for help, her little hands clutching the sides of his tunic. Behind her came another, her twin brother, who took a gentler approach, crawling up the opposite side and resting his head against Alexander's chest. They were 3 now, wild, curious, and nothing like the life he once imagined, but everything he didn't know he needed. Luna entered moments later carrying a tray of fruit and warm flatbread. Her long hair was half tied, her sleeves rolled up, and her eyes still carried that unmistakable glow of someone who lived not for power, but for presence. "You kidnapped their attention again," she teased. Alexander grinned. "I paid them in stories." "Did you skip the part where the prince was rescued by a mysterious desert queen?" "I upgraded her title to Empress," he said, "for historical accuracy." She laughed, soft, warm, familiar, and his chest swelled with something deeper than love. It was peace. Later that day, Luna led a workshop in the courtyard of the Academy of Healing, her creation. Dozens of students gathered beneath the stone arches, learning not only about herbs and energy, but about listening, about seeing beyond pain, about touching without fear. The Academy had become one of the jewels of Solterra, but Luna refused to wear that crown. She preferred to plant the seeds and let others grow. Back in the palace, Alexander worked alongside Elias in the strategy room, not for war, but for diplomacy, treaties, education reform, a new water distribution system for the outposts near the cliffs. He ruled with vision, but never alone. Whenever a voice trembled in court, Luna would step in, firm, kind, precise. And when Alexander's temper threatened to surface, she calmed him not with words but with a glance. Together they ruled not from power but from presence. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep curled beside the fire, Alexander and Luna sat in the garden. It was their favorite hour. When the desert cooled, when the stars began to climb, when the silence was no longer something to escape but something to cherish. She rested her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined this," she whispered. He kissed her temple. "I did." She smiled. "Liar." He chuckled. "Half-truth. I imagined you. The rest was a miracle." She looked up at him. "Do you still dream of walking again?" He paused, then answered honestly. "I used to dream of what I lost. Now I dream of what I have." Her eyes shimmered. "You never stopped rising, Alexander." He touched her hand, threading his fingers between hers. "And you never let me fall." In the distance, the towers of Solterra glowed under the silver moon. A kingdom once shaken by betrayal now stood on roots deeper than stone, and beneath its arches 2 children dreamed. A queen healed, a king led, and 2 souls, once strangers beneath the same sky, now breathed in rhythm, no longer broken, no longer waiting, but fully home. He didn't walk again, but he learned to walk with what can't be seen. She didn't come to save him. She came to remind him of who he was. And in the place where there was once silence and fear, now blooms an entire kingdom of courage and love. Because true power was never in the legs. It was in the heart that chose to feel even after falling. And perhaps in the end, this story isn't about kingdoms, but about souls that recognize each other. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this message from? Your presence here gives meaning to all of this.